Thank you for joining us. Our Hangout today is with Sue Stephenson and Ardeth Staz. It is on lessons learned.
Well, thank you, Alex. Some say trust is like money. It's hard to earn and it's easy to lose. So it's fitting that our Hangout today focuses on 5 lessons we've learned along the way while using Leading with Trust for Solution Tree, with small and large groups in many settings. So the first lesson we learned involves an activity that Ardeth will describe for participants in a few minutes, but it centers around our work with the 6 barriers to trust, which I describe on pages 13 to 19. So the first barrier to trust is fear, and it leads to a culture of silence and prevents people from speaking up and talking about undiscussables. The next barrier, betrayal, is really a breach of trust that inhibits people from trusting again. Third, a carousel of leaders or moving leaders around too often is a barrier because it prevents people from buying in, and they think, this leader too shall pass. The next barrier, adversarial relationships, leads to an us and them mentality with winners and losers. The 5th barrier is inappropriate staff development, which prevents interaction if it's a kind of sit and get format or if it has no follow-up. And we remember Michelle, a participant at one of our workshops, who wisely raised a critical 6th barrier, which I think is a result of the first 5 and should be added to the list. And she called it our lack of knowledge about each other and what our stories are.
So in our workshops, after we've identified the types of barriers, usually through the use of a Prezi, we divide participants into groups. And each group examines one barrier in detail and comes up with an example, fictional or real, of what that barrier might look like. And then they present this to the large group. We've had some very intensive discussions in our workshops. It seems that everybody has an example to share about the kinds of barriers they're beginning to recognize are in existence. By the time the activity is completed, participants have a very good handle on the barriers, and they're able to recognize them in their own setting. Recognizing the barriers is the first step to overcoming them. Next lesson has to do with step 5 in the 10 steps that we talked about in our last Hangout. Step 5 was about collecting data or feedback, and it was described on pages 49 to 53. There are some lessons we've learned and want to share with you so that you'll be successful with this one.
Yes, you'll want to be careful collecting data about trust. In order to lessen the suspicion around your motives, you'll need to introduce your rationale and how the data will be shared with the staff and how it could be used to plan future actions. The questions you select and the scale you use are both critical. And we'd like to suggest a small change to the scale that I used in the surveys on page 208 to 210. And we'd suggest leaving out the uncertain and completely disagree choices on that scale so that it's more balanced and a choice is expected. We want to emphasize the use of SurveyMonkey to successfully gather anonymous data online, even anecdotal comments. And we once used that software 3 times over about 18 months with one particular group I'm thinking of, and we tailored the questions to suit their needs and gathered an impressive amount of data that we acted on. So it's critical to plan for anonymity in distrust cultures when you're collecting data. And one lesson we learned using the trust glass was to ask participants to hand us a paper vote of where they thought their group was on the trust glass that we tabulated and reported back to the group. When we first started doing this, we used to ask them to vote right on a trust glass right on the chart paper. But we quickly found out that they followed the trend or they followed the leader with their vote, especially if they all knew each other. So anonymity is required when you're working with a toxic, distrusting culture. As trust grows, they will be more comfortable using a trusting show of hands or the commitment continuum on page 211 to show their degrees of support. So it may be hard to accept the initial data that you receive on trust surveys, but have the courage to keep going and focus on making some visible changes that will act on that data. So the third lesson we want to share with you today comes from how we've used Patrick Lencioni's personal histories activity with many groups, both large and small, right, Ardeth?
Mm-hmm. So even though the questions used in this activity seem simple, questions, for example, where were you born, how many siblings do you have, where do you stand in the birth order, and what challenge did you have as a child that may have prepared you for your job today, you need to be prepared for these to elicit strong responses from participants, especially with that last question. And you can find this activity and the questions on page 63. In this activity, we're asking participants to make themselves a bit vulnerable by sharing this information with the group. So as a facilitator, it's important to offer participants the right to pass. Sometimes participants need to see what type or depth of sharing and opening up others do before they'll be ready to take this risk. It helps when we model as facilitators by sharing this information ourselves as part of describing the activity beforehand. But be prepared to hand out Kleenex if things get a little emotional. We always debrief this activity with a discussion about how participants felt when they made themselves vulnerable to others.
Yes, I really agree that doing this activity can be very emotional. And we often quote Lencioni, who says, trust is about vulnerability, and team members who trust one another learn to be comfortable being open, even exposed to one another around their failures and weaknesses and even their fears. We find if people can be comfortable with this activity, then they can feel comfortable risking to put their ideas and suggestions on the table, and they can be more creative and think out loud during brainstorming and decision making. And we found this strategy to be very powerful in helping groups to develop trust.
So the fourth lesson that we'd like to share with you today involves how we often toss around the terminology of group and team as if they were the same. However, what we found is as a group reaches higher levels of trust, there's always a need to think about how they can get even better. So in our workshops, we help participants identify when they have actually matured into a team. And then we use some higher risk strategies from the book to help them develop even further.
Right. So for example, when we envision a professional learning community team, we often think of it as a team that has established trust and has progressed from poor to fair to good and maybe even to great. For higher trusting teams, we're talking about the use of higher risk activities, such as building a set of belief statements, a mission, or a vision. But here are a few other activities that work well with groups in that early and developing trust stage. On page 131, we talk about starting conversations and sharing our stories. And at this point, we always introduce the concept of courageous conversations, and we role play how a difficult conversation could be crafted to put a trust issue on the table. Higher trusting teams are ready to learn more about the change process itself, conflict and resistance. And you can refer to page 137 for this as they start to do real work together and make decisions together. Teams also benefit from reading the 2 case studies I included about Saturn automobiles and Southwest Airlines in Chapter 5. And often there we have people identify characteristics of high trust, healthy cultures, and compare them to their own team. And lastly, in this part, we often use video clips. A favorite of ours is from the movie Sister Act, where the choir progresses from poor to great. Or a more serious clip, The Race to the South Pole, which is compares 2 historical groups and their leaders from the DVD called The 5 Waves of Trust, available from Franklin Covey. You may have other video suggestions too.
So since you wrote Leading with Trust, and through the work with various groups and your continuing research, you've developed another graphic that you call the Circle of Trust, which basically organizes everything you know and believe about understanding and building trust. You want to tell us a little bit more about the graphic? And Alex will put that up for us, I'm sure.
Yes, I found synthesizing the Circle of Trust helpful to categorize 8 components of trust in one graphic. And I did this about a year after working with the book, so it's not actually in the book itself, but I encourage people to share it with others. So participants analyze the 8 segments and decide which ones need attention in their trust building plan, personally and interpersonally. So fairness, respect, and honesty are closely connected components, and they're parts of trust. Having a belief that teams really can be more effective than individuals can involves risk-taking and a shared vision. And I've always believed that teams that can have a good laugh together are often more creative. And it goes without saying that a healthy degree of competence is critical to building trust. So the Circle of Trust is a fitting way to come to the conclusion of this hangout. Ardeth and I wish readers of Leading with Trust all the success we can as you find the courage to make trust discussable and build teams for the benefit of student learning and for staff commitment. So we wish everyone good luck.
And thanks for hanging out with us.
Yeah, it's been fun.